So you had this all expenses paid jolly where he went off to Sweden and sort of looked at all of the boats and things that they were digging there, and came back. And strangely enough, when he came back, his immediate thoughts were, this is a Swedish ship.
Yes.
This is a Scandinavian origin.
Welcome back for more about Sutton Hoo, the true story, and here we see how poor old Basil starts to get pushed out, political powers take over, and this Scandinavian story starts to be almost invented and imposed on the story, and over time has just become a sort of pseudo-fact.
Yeah, so what Basil found, basically, was the outline of a ship. There was actually no wood whatsoever left of it. All he found in the ground was the rivets. And this is why this guy's so amazing. Self-taught archaeologist, he then very carefully dug out what was there and followed the lines of the rivets to give the outline of the boat. What you're looking at isn't anything solid. It is all that's solid are these lines of rivets, the black lines that you can see, which form the outline of the boat. And then all of the cross beams that you see of the boat aren't there. They're just impressions in the earth, very faint ghostly impressions. It was a ghost boat, not a real boat.
Yeah, meticulous piece of archaeology by him, isn't it? It's fantastic, or his team there.
No, and he didn't get credit. He didn't get the credit at the time for that. What happened was in June. What happened was as soon as Basil made the discovery, you started getting the politicking going on. Yeah. There was a short press release issued by the Ipswich Museum, who wanted to try and get their hands on the discovery, so any of the grave goods would end up in the Ipswich Museum. So he leaked it to the press. And it was like it is today. There was a lot of press interest. The press were out there. They were flying overhead in airplanes trying to get photographs of it. There were a lot of people on site. If you see some of the photographs of the excavation, there's sailors and all kind of people all stood around the side coming to look at it. But as a result of the press release, a guy called Charles Phillips, a professional archaeologist, came along in June 1939 to look at the site. And he realized that it didn't just have regional importance, it had national importance. So at that point, he then reported the discovery to the British Museum. And again, there's bound to have been some kind of politicking and inter-academic infighting going here. You had the guy at the Ipswich Museum wanting to get his hands on it. Yeah, you had Charles Phillips, a professional archaeologist, wanting to dig it. He reported it to the British Museum. And because Basil was not a professional archaeologist, but self-taught, Charles Phillips, surprise, surprise, was appointed by the British Museum to continue the digging work. When he left,
can I just interrupt? How did the British Museum claim the rights on the property then? Was that by a...
Well, because it's of national importance. Yeah, because it was such national importance. I mean, the site belonged to Edith Pretty, and she basically, at that point, had control of the site. But the British Museum, no doubt, would have contacted her and told it was of such a national importance they would have to get the top guys on the job.
So it'd be her. They'd need her permission, you think, then, rather than order or something. I just wonder what jurisdiction they use to do this.
Well, at that point, I think it would be just persuasion. You know, if you were a landowner and someone comes and tells you, well, this is a major national, but this is going to be one of the biggest things ever happened in British archaeology. We need some professional guys on it. Oh, Basil, he's not up to it. And what happened was Charles Phillips left the site and told Basil to stop digging immediately. And between Basil and Edith Pretty, they decided to continue. And by the time that they came back with a digging team, they basically uncovered the boat. So, you know, again,
good for them, yeah.
You got all this politics and infighting going on a discovery, and it's like any new major discovery, everyone wants to get the credit for it. So you had the Ipswich Museum trying to get the credit, Charles Phillips trying to get the credit, the British Museum trying to get the credit, and poor Basil was just elbowed out the way, essentially, and he became forgotten in the story for a very long time. So they continued the digging, and they finished digging in August 1939, and at that point then they had a coroner's inquest to determine whether it was treasure trove. And this is where the interesting story becomes. In the digging, one of the noticeable things that was absent was a body. So when they dug this, they didn't find the remains of a body, no skeletons or no human remains whatsoever. They found all the grave goods, all laid out as if it was around the body, but no body itself. And you know, that was quite crucial, I think, in determining at the coroner's inquest that it wasn't treasure trove. You know, nobody was going to come back and find this treasure. So, and ultimately they determined that the grave goods, and then there was quite a lot of them, as we see later on, and some of them very high quality, all belonged to Edith Pretty. So, so what happened next then was she then donated all of the goods, again, because she'd been persuaded that they were of national importance, to the British Museum. And then the British Museum took them back to London. And in 1940, now, one of the things, again, I've got to point out here is that this boat was excavated basically between June 1939 and August 1939. Now, if you look at a modern excavation, something of this caliber and something of this significance, it would take 3 or 4 years at least to dig it and go through it, because they would dig it out very carefully. They would start at the top. They would sieve out all of the fill material, etc., to find all the bits and pieces. But what was happening around at the time, as we all know, was, you know, the Second World War was imminent. And the intention was at the time, and Charles Phillips was no doubt very aware of this, was we had to get this all done and dusted before the war come along. Otherwise, it would be lost forever. So in 1940, it was all taken back down to the British Museum. They held a very short exhibition of the grave goods, but because of the war, they then were stored in an unused section of the underground near Heddwch. And then if we go back up the line here, we then come to our last character in this story. Now, this is the most important, he's the most important person in many respects. I actually think Basil Brown is the most important person, but for the interpretation of it and the subsequent what happened to the grave goods, Rupert Bruce-Mitford is the guy. He joined the British Museum just before in 1939, just before the Second World War started. And then he had to go away, like everyone, to war, 1942. He didn't come back until 1944. He is what I term Mr. Sutton Hoo. He worked for the British Museum from 1939 until 1977, I think it was, and 1977. And immediately after the war, he was appointed by the British Museum to be the director of Anglo-Saxon material, which included the Sutton Hoo boat. And he became Mr. Sutton Hoo. Yeah, he had total control of the artifacts. He could determine which were restored, which were given out or loaned or let other historians and archaeologists look at it. He had total control of all the material, and he was the one who was going to write up all of the publications and the reports on it. So like all archaeologists, what he was looking for was, okay, we got this Sutton Hoo boat, pretty unique in Britain at the time. Yeah, it's a bigger boat than the one that had been earlier uncovered at Snape, and he was looking for a context for it, and there wasn't any in Britain. So he looked where else were there these kind of boat burials, and of course he went straight away across to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. So in 1947, this was just after the war, the British Museum didn't have any funds. But he went on a 6-week, all expenses paid trip to Sweden.
Very nice.
And this was paid for by the Swedish universities who were digging up the similar ship burials in Sweden. So he went to see which were dating from the Vendel period and the Viking period. So you had this all expenses paid jolly where he went off to Sweden and sort of looked at all of the boats and things that they were digging there, and came back. And strangely enough, when he came back, his immediate thoughts were, this is a Swedish ship.
Yes.
This is a Scandinavian origin. And the three of the big grave good finds that we got, which we'll look at later, were the sword, and the shield, and the helmet.
Of course,
helmet. And he considered those, as soon as he got back, to be of Swedish origin because he had seen similar helmets, similar swords, similar shields in Sweden. And this is what archaeologists and historians do. They always got to look for context. You come across something that's unique, something that's new, something that's novel, and you've got to find, well, we don't know anything about it at all. Zero. Mm-hmm. What looks like it? Where could it come from? What is it similar to? Yeah, can we put together some kind of a narrative showing that it came from over here, it was migration, or it was trade, or whatever, visitors. You've got to look for how this arrived, this unique thing arrived in Britain, because there's nothing like it.
It does seem to be, I agree with you. It does seem to be a curiously British thing in a way, though. Like when they find the Vendel dig and the Vendel boat, they didn't say, "Oh, I wonder where this comes from." Let's see if we can find one in Britain or something. It's always easily one direction. This kind of looking, isn't it?
Exactly, but it's like everything else in history. You've got something novel, so you try and look for a context for it. You try and look for something similar, and if you actually look again, one of the big things we got with Whistle and Blackett is the Egyptian, the Egyptian timelines, which everything else is linked back to. Well, they were theories and proposals put forward in Victorian times because they didn't have any other context in which to do it. And all of a sudden now, over 100 years later, we're still stuck with these theories and speculations of these armchair historians at the time, because
almost 200 years later in that case,
because they didn't have the context that they could put it into. And I've had the discussion with you before. We've got potential ship burials in Wales. If one of these had been excavated in the Victorian times, he would have a context. He wouldn't have perhaps gone to Sweden. He would have perhaps got in his car and driven to Wales to go and see King Kerry's ship burial, for example.
Yes,
and that would be his context. And we would end up with perhaps a different narrative and a different story to what we got today, because his starting point would have been different.
Good point, yes.
And the unfortunate thing with academics is, and especially people like Rupert Bruce-Mitford, because of his position and because of the control he had over the Sutton Hoo boat, he became Mr. Sutton Hoo. Nobody else could have access to it unless through him. So he's not going to let people like you or I look at it, who have got different theories to his theories. He's only going to look at it to academics and people like that who are supporting
what he said, yeah.
forward. And from that point onwards, everything becomes set in stone. Now, I don't say that he's doing this deliberately, he's falsifying history or he's distorting history deliberately. It's just that's the way it is. He didn't have a context. He went and found the context. And from that point onwards,
he defended context.
He built his edifice on this, what I believe to be a very shaky and insubstantial foundation.
Well, thank you for watching that programme. Hope you enjoyed it. The next one, we're looking at how the whole idea of a body without a body was followed up on a ship without a ship, or was it a boat? And how the evidence has started to be appear to fill this story and make it work. So please remember to subscribe and look out for more videos, notifications, and help us with our work. You'll see all the things we're doing, exploring around. Like there's a lion's stone there. We're looking at ancient stone megalithic structures being destroyed. There's a place there where I've written a book about Cymroglyphics based on Wilson and Blackett's work, where you can read hieroglyphs using Welsh. There's Facebook groups. Please consider being a Patreon group. Just a few pounds a month will help us keep going, because my goodness, there is so much hidden history. It's up to us to find it, reveal it, and save it for future generations, and find out just what on earth is going on. So until the next time, Heddwch.